The wind cut sharp through the canyon of glass and steel, carrying with it the scent of salt from the harbor and the faint bitterness of exhaust. The bus wheezed as it pulled into the stop, brakes squealing, headlights catching the swirls of snowflakes that had begun to fall. It was the last stop in Boston's financial district for the evening, and the passengers spilled out with the same hurried indifference as always callers pulled up. Gloves clutching briefcases, fast food, bags swinging like trophies of convenience. Their laughter was quick and brittle, echoing against the buildings. The kind of laughter people use to push away the cold and the darkness dot near the curb. A child stood awkwardly balanced on a pair of scuffed wooden crutches. Her frame was small, thinner than it should have been, her face pale in the glow of the streetlights. The coat she wore swallowed her whole, sleeves bunched at the wrists, the hem dragging dangerously close to the slush at her feet. Strapped across her back, like a secret she wasn't sure she had the right to carry, was a violin case so scratched and battered it looked as though it had survived more winters than she had. Lily Morgan was only 7 years old, but the hollow ache in her eyes made her look older, like someone who had already carried too much. She shifted on her crutches as the crowd passed, her breath clouding the air. "Please, sir," she called, voice trembling, nearly lost in the rumble of engines and footsteps. "Could I play a song for your leftovers?" Her words were soft, but they carried something desperate, something that cracked against the cold and made a few heads turn. The men who had just stepped off the bus slowed, exchanging smirks. One of them, still holding a steaming carton of noodles, let out a chuckle. Another pulled his scarf tighter, amusement glittering in his eyes. "Play a song," one repeated, shaking his head as though the idea itself were a joke. Frank Dalton, the driver, lingered near the bus doors. He was a man in his mid-40s, with broad shoulders hunched from years of long shifts and a face lined not by age, but by disappointment. His cap sat low over his brow, shadowing eyes that had grown too accustomed to ignoring. He had heard 100 requests like this in his career coins. "Food, just a ride, mister." Most times, he turned his back. Tonight was no different. The girl was just another kid trying to squeeze sympathy from strangers. "You should be home," he muttered, his voice rough from too many cigarettes and a little sleep. "This ain't the place." He shifted his weight, ready to move on, ready to shake her small, fragile figure from his mind like snow off a boot. But Lily, summoning courage from some place deeper than hunger, took a step closer. Her crutch slipped on a patch of ice, and before anyone could react, her tiny body pitched forward. The violin case hit the ground with a clatter, the hollow sound of wood against concrete carrying down the street. She caught herself awkwardly, palms stinging against the frozen sidewalk. Her face flushed not from pain, but from humiliation. The laughter that followed was louder this time, more pointed. Frank's gaze flicked to the violin case lying half open, on the ground. Inside, the instrument's worn wood glowed faintly under the streetlight. Strings dull but intact, a strange contrast to the rags and shadows of the child who owned it. Something tugged at him, a memory he didn't want, of another violin held by smaller hands, of music in a house long emptied of warmth. He clenched his jaw and looked away. "Get up, kid," one of the businessmen said, still grinning. "Streets, no place to be practicing." Another tossed a French fry in her direction, as if mocking the bargain she had offered. Lily gathered herself slowly, knuckles raw from the fall. She pulled the case close, as though the battered violin were the only thing tethering her to dignity. Her eyes shone wet, but defiant, the tears refusing to fall. Frank turned, muttering under his breath, but as he climbed the bus steps, the sound of that violin case hitting the pavement echoed in his ears like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Something in him felt unsettled, though he didn't yet understand why. The bus rumbled along empty streets, its engine growling like a tired beast as Frank Dalton steered it toward the depot. The heaters wheezed lukewarm air, but the cold still clung to him, burrowed into his bones. He tried to shake it off, tried to let the night dissolve into the routine of the end of a shift, but the image of that little girl wouldn't leave. The coat too big for her body, the crutches wobbling, the violin case clattering on the pavement like something fragile shattering in slow motion. He told himself he'd seen it all before. Boston had its share of street kids, some runaways, some hustlers, some with stories that tugged at your heart until you realized they weren't true. He had trained himself to harden, to keep his head down and his wallet shut. He didn't have the time or money to bleed compassion for every sob story, but there had been something different about her. Something that hit him like a punch he wasn't ready for. Her voice, small but steady, asking to trade music for scraps, not begging, not whining. Asking. Frank pulled the bus into the depot, cut the ignition, and sat in the silence that followed. The fluorescent lights hummed above, washing the world in pale yellow. He rubbed his temples, his fingers gritty with exhaustion. All he wanted was to go home to his one-bedroom apartment, heat up leftover chili, and fall asleep in front of the television. But when he closed his eyes, he didn't see chili or television. He saw the girl, sprawled on the sidewalk, clutching that violin case like it was her last lifeline. And then came the memory he didn't want. A boy no older than 12, standing in the living room of a house that no longer belonged to him, violin tucked awkwardly under his chin, his son, Tyler, before the divorce, before Frank lost the house, his wife, and eventually his relationship with the boy who had once begged him to come hear him practice. Tyler had given up the violin after his mother remarried, traded it for headphones and silence. Frank hadn't been there to fight for the music in him. That guilt had hardened into the kind of armor a man never takes off. Asterisk. Now here was another child with a violin, and Frank had laughed, just like everyone else. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his coat, and left the depot. His boots echoed against the concrete as he walked, breath steaming in the air. The streets were thinner now, shadows stretching longer between the street lamps. He wasn't sure why he was walking back toward the financial district instead of home. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was conscience. Maybe it was the echo of that violin case hitting the ground, a sound that wouldn't let him rest. When he reached the corner where he'd last seen her, the crowd was gone. The sidewalks were slick with frost, the glass towers towering like cold giants. For a moment, he thought she had left too. Relief washed over him. He could finally go home, free of responsibility. But then he spotted her, tucked into the alcove of a closed storefront, huddled against the wind. The violin case was open in her lap, her small hands cradling the instrument with the tenderness of someone holding a wounded bird. Frank lingered across the street, hidden in the shadows, watching. She lifted the violin to her chin, positioned the bow with a care far beyond her years, and began to play. The first note cut the silence like a blade, clear, resonant, startling. It was not the screech of an untrained child. It was something else, something pure. Something that made Frank's chest tighten as though the air itself had turned solid. The melody floated out into the night, carried by the wind, weaving its way between the cold glass buildings. It was not a tune he recognized, yet it was filled with sorrow and longing so raw it made his throat ache. He saw her eyes close. Her lips moved silently as though she were praying through the strings. The sound was fragile and defiant at once, a voice too big for a girl so small. A man walking his dog stopped, transfixed. A woman paused, tears shining in her eyes. One by one, strangers slowed, listening. A circle began to form, the city's cold rhythm breaking under the spell of her music. And Frank hard. Better. Frank stood frozen on the opposite curb, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. He had dismissed her. He had laughed, and yet here she was, turning a frozen Boston street into a cathedral with nothing but a battered violin. Asterisk. He told himself to walk away, to leave her to her crowd, but he couldn't. He crossed the street, slowly, drawn forward like a man approaching something sacred with every step. The music burrowed deeper under his skin, into the cracks he had spent years patching with cynicism. And as he reached the edge of the circle of listeners, he realized, with a jolt, that the girl hadn't asked for charity at all. She had asked to be heard. And he, of all people, had failed to listen. Asterisk. Frank Dalton stood at the edge of the circle, arms crossed, his breath thick in the cold air. The crowd applauded softly, reverently, as if they had stumbled into some private miracle they didn't deserve. Lily bowed her head, lowering the violin into her lap. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of pouring out everything inside her into the strings. For a heartbeat, the world held still. And then reality rushed back. People began to shuffle, tossing coins and bills into the violin case as though buying a piece of the wonder they had just witnessed. A businessman muttered, "That kid's got talent," while slipping a $5 bill among the coins. Another took out his phone, recording, already thinking about the views the video would rack up online. The spell was breaking, and Frank felt an odd heat rise in his chest. They had laughed minutes ago, and now they treated her like a novelty act, enough Frank muttered under his breath, surprising even himself with the sharpness of his tone. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. The onlookers turned, startled at the intrusion of the gruff bus driver still in uniform. He looked at Lily, her pale face shining with sweat and exhaustion. "One song doesn't prove anything," he said, the words harsh, though not cruel. "Anyone can stumble into a lucky moment." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Lily blinked, surprised, but she didn't flinch. She set the violin gently back under her chin. "I can play." Again, she whispered, her voice barely carrying. Frank frowned. He hadn't expected her to answer so quickly, with such calm. His instinct was to wave it off, to walk away, to protect himself from the knot twisting in his chest. But the part of him that remembered his son, that remembered the silence, that came after the music left his house, spoke louder. "If you're truly what they think you are," he said, gesturing to the crowd, "then play something no one here expects. Play something that isn't safe." The challenge landed like a stone dropped into water. The crowd leaned in. Someone whispered, "What's he doing?" Lily's eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in quiet resolve. She adjusted her bow, shifting slightly on her crutches. And then, without another word, she began. The sound that poured forth was darker, sharp a storm where there had been snowfall. The bow cut across the strings with precision and fury, unleashing Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. The notes soared upward, wild and defiant, spinning into the night like fire. Her small body swayed with each movement, hair escaping its tie. Face alight with something that looked like both pain and joy. Frank felt his throat close. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was mastery, raw, unrefined, but undeniable. He remembered sitting in a folding chair years ago, watching Tyler's trembling bow scratch across the strings, thinking how much patience it took to hear beauty beneath the noise. But this little girl, this Lily, was no beginner clawing at melody. She was already a musician, a vessel for something bigger than herself. The crowd erupted into applause again, louder this time, shouts of disbelief breaking through. Someone shouted, "She's a prodigy." Another, near tears, whispered, "She plays like her life depends on it." Phones lit up the night, capturing every movement, every note. Frank stood rooted, every instinct at war. He had mocked her, brushed her off. Now he saw something he could neither explain nor ignore. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of shame, not at her, but at himself. Lily lowered the violin, her breathing ragged, her cheeks flushed red. She looked at Frank directly, her gaze steady. "Was that enough?" she asked softly. Frank opened his mouth, but no words came. He only nodded, once, slow and heavy. The sound of the crowd washed around him, but it was distant, unimportant. What mattered was the way the girl's music had reached into him, pulled apart walls he hadn't even realized were still standing. But even as the applause thundered, another figure stepped from the shadows, a man in a long coat, face pale under the streetlight, eyes calculating. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He only watched Lily with the sharp interest of someone who saw not a child, but an opportunity. Frank noticed him immediately, and unease prickled the back of his neck. Something told him the night's miracle wasn't going to end here. Something darker had just entered the stage. The applause still echoed down the glass canyon of the street, ricocheting between buildings until it melted into the hum of the city. Lily lowered her violin, sweat shining along her brow, the bow trembling in her small hand. The crowd began to scatter, some leaving bills in her case, others whispering in disbelief. Phones still glowing with videos that would soon find their way online. But the air hadn't settled. It carried a charge, a tension that clung even as footsteps faded. Frank Dalton stood stiff, his jaw clenched, his fists buried deep in his coat pockets. He couldn't explain why his chest ached the way it did, like something inside had cracked open. He wanted to tell the girl she had been extraordinary. He wanted to tell her she deserved more than cold streets and mockery. But before he could, he noticed him, the man who had stepped from the shadows. The one who hadn't clapped, hadn't even blinked during Lily's performance. Tall, pale, with a sharp jaw and a scarf wrapped neatly at his throat. The stranger's eyes never left Lily. They weren't warm eyes, not softened by music or wonder. They were calculating, predatory, the eyes of a man who saw numbers where others saw humanity. He didn't approach like a fan. He stalked closer like a buyer circling. "Merchandise. Remarkable," the man said, his voice smooth to smooth. "Absolutely remarkable. For a child to play like that. It's unheard of. He crouched slightly, as though addressing Lily at her level, though the tilt of his mouth betrayed no gentleness. "What's your name, darling?" Lily hugged, the violin against her chest, her chin lifting in wary defiance. "Lily," she said softly, her voice barely audible. The man's smile deepened, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Lily, yes, you and I should talk. I know important people who would pay dearly to see you play. You could be on a stage tomorrow, Carnegie Hall, Europe, wherever you want." He leaned closer, lowering his voice, though Frank still caught every word. "You shouldn't waste that gift playing for scraps on a cold sidewalk." Frank's stomach twisted. He knew the type. He'd driven plenty of men like him in his years behind the wheel, agents, talent scouts, promoters, who spoke like saviors but moved like vultures. They never wanted the person, only the profit. "Back off," Frank muttered, stepping forward, his boots loud on the pavement. His voice was gravel, rough and certain. The stranger glanced up, eyes narrowing in faint irritation. "And you are her driver," Frank said without hesitation, surprising himself. "And I don't think she needs your kind of help." The man straightened, adjusting his scarf. "You don't know who I am. I could change her life. She's 7. Frank snapped, his voice echoing louder than he intended. "She needs food, safety, a roof, not your promises." The man's gaze hardened. "Promises? No. Opportunities. Do you have the means to get her out of this gutter? Do you have the money for lessons, instruments, doctors? Or are you just another man passing by, pretending to care?" The words cut, sharper than Frank wanted to admit, because wasn't that exactly what he was? A tired bus driver who had already failed one child. He had nothing to offer her except a warm coat and maybe a hot meal. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't anyone. Lily's eyes darted between them, wide and frightened, as if she could feel the invisible tug of war over her future. Her fingers tightened on the violin until her knuckles turned white. Frank swallowed hard, his voice dropping low. "Maybe I don't have money, but I won't let her get chewed up by men like you." The stranger studied him, then smiled faintly, as if amused. "We'll see." He slipped a card into Lily's violin case, ignoring Frank completely. "When you're ready for the world, Lily, call me." And then he melted back into the darkness, his footsteps quiet, leaving only the chill of his presence behind. Silence stretched. Frank bent down, snatched the card, and crumpled it in his fist. "Don't ever talk to that man again," he muttered, his voice softer now, but urgent. Lily blinked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her tone fragile, curious. Frank hesitated. He didn't know. He had spent years building walls against everyone's needs, refusing to get involved, refusing to feel. But when he looked at Lily, frail, trembling, yet burning with a fire in her music, he saw what he had lost with his own son. He saw a second chance, one he hadn't earned but couldn't ignore, because someone should. He finally said, asterisk. A sharp gust of wind rattled down the street, making Lily shiver violently. Frank looked around, then sighed. "Come on," he muttered, gesturing toward his bus parked down the block. "Let's get you warm." Lily hesitated, hugging her violin close. But then, slowly, she nodded. Frank adjusted his stride to match her halting pace on the crutches, his shadow stretching long beside hers under the streetlights. Neither of them knew it yet, but this uneasy walk was the first step into a battle neither had expected, one that would pit them against powerful men, against the weight of poverty and pride, and against their own fears. And in the middle of it all, a paralyzed little girl with a violin would hold the key to breaking them or saving them. Asterisk. Frank Dalton hadn't planned on taking anyone home that night. He had no blueprint for what came after a street corner performance that cracked his heart wide open. All he knew was that the girl shivered, her lips were turning blue, and the thought of leaving her to the dark felt like a sin. So he led her toward his idling bus, its hulking shape waiting like some old, tired beast against the curb. Lily limped beside him, one crutch sliding every few steps. Her violin case was strapped firmly to her back, as though it was more vital than breath itself. Frank slowed his long strides, matching her uneven pace. He felt clumsy, out of place. He was a bus driver, not a rescuer, not a guardian angel. Yet when Lily glanced up at him, her eyes filled not with fear, but with something close to trust. He felt a weight settle across his shoulders. He lowered the ramp and helped her aboard. The bus was empty now, rows of plastic seats glowing under the sickly yellow lights. She sank into the front seat, hugging her violin. Frank slid into the driver's chair, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. He wasn't even sure where to take her. He couldn't bring her to his crumbling apartment, and she clearly belonged somewhere. But where? Where's home, kid? He asked gruffly, his voice carrying more gentleness than he expected. The orphanage, she whispered. St. Mary's. But she trailed off, biting her lip. But what? They don't understand, she said, her voice wobbling. They say music's a distraction. I practice at night. But if they catch me, they take the violin away. I had to hide it. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He thought of his son's abandoned violin gathering dust in some pawn shop years ago. That instrument is no distraction, he muttered, almost to himself. The bus rumbled through Boston's quieter streets until they reached the orphanage. A sagging brick building, its windows dark except for a few flickering lights. A cross hung crooked over the entrance, and the paint peeled in long strips like shedding skin. It didn't look like home. It looked like survival. As they approached, the heavy front door creaked open. A stocky woman in a faded sweater stormed out, her face tight with fury. Lily Morgan, she barked, voice cutting the cold air. Do you have any idea what hour it is? Her eyes flicked to Frank, suspicion sharpening her features. And who are you? Bus driver, Frank said flatly. She was freezing on the street. I wasn't about to leave her there. The woman, Mrs. Harris. As Lily whispered, grabbed the child's arm, tugging her toward the doorway. This one's always sneaking off, causing trouble. Don't think you're doing her any favors, mister. Discipline's what she needs, not sympathy. Frank stepped forward, his chest tightening. Discipline? She nearly collapsed out there. What she needs is food, warmth, someone to notice her before she disappears. Mrs. Harris's mouth thinned to a sharp line. Don't lecture me. I've raised hundreds of children through these doors. You don't know her. You don't know us. She pulled Lily inside, the door groaning shut behind them. For a moment, Frank stood there in the icy dark, fist clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. It wasn't his fight. He wasn't her father. He wasn't anyone who mattered. But then he heard it faint through the cracked windows, a violin string humming. Not full music, just a note, shaky but deliberate. Lily was already defying them, already clinging to the one thing they wanted to take. The door opened again, but this time it was Mrs. Harris. A slender woman in a dark coat stepped out, her breath forming clouds. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with quiet intensity. You saw her play? She asked, her tone urgent. Frank blinked. Yeah, I saw. She's something else. The woman extended her hand. Dr. Sarah Williams, music therapist at Boston Children's Hospital. I've been watching her for weeks, waiting for her to step out of the shadows. Tonight proved what I suspected. She's not just gifted, she's once in a generation. Frank shook her hand, still wary. And what does that mean? That she's a circus act now? Another card in some rich man's deck. Dr. Williams's gaze hardened. No, it means she needs protection, real training, real opportunity. And if the wrong people get their hands on her. She paused, scanning the street. The man tonight, the one in the scarf, I know who he is. He's no patron of the arts. He's an exploiter. If he gets close to her, she'll be used up and discarded before she's even 15. The words sank like stones in Frank's stomach. He thought of the card the man had slipped into Lily's case, the false smile that hadn't reached his eyes. He thought of Mrs. Harris dismissing Lily's music as mischief. And he thought of Lily herself, bow in hand, wringing heartbreak and beauty from broken strings. Dr. Williams stepped closer. You were the one who stood up for her tonight, weren't you? You didn't laugh like the others. You challenged her. She needs someone like that. Someone to guard her until she's old enough to stand alone. Frank's throat went dry. He had failed his own son, lost his family, buried himself in a bus route that never ended. How could he protect anyone? And yet, as he stared at the orphanage windows glowing dim against the night, he realized the truth he already cared. The girl had gotten under his skin, carved herself into a part of him that hadn't felt alive in years. Snow began to fall harder, the flakes swirling like ash under the street light. Frank shoved his hands into his pockets, his voice low but steady. Then I guess I'm in this now. Whatever it takes. Dr. Williams nodded once, relief flickering in her eyes. Then prepare yourself. Mr. Dalton. Because protecting Lily, Morgan won't just change her life, it's going to change yours. And not everyone will let her go without a fight. Behind them, unseen, the man in the scarf watched from across the street, a cigarette glowing in his hand. He exhaled smoke into the storm, his lips curving in a cold smile. The game had only just begun. Asterisk, the city felt different the next morning, though nothing had changed on the surface. Buses still roared down frozen avenues. Commuters still shuffled with coffee cups steaming in their hands. Yet for Frank Dalton, the streets no longer belonged only to traffic and timetables. Every corner now carried the memory of a little girl, with a violin who had stopped the world in its tracks. He couldn't focus on his route. Passengers complained about the cold, about the delays, about the endless grind of city life, and Frank muttered his usual replies. But in his head, he was back on that sidewalk, hearing Lily pull storms and prayers out of thin air. He kept seeing the stranger in the scarf, the one whose eyes had stripped Lily down to a commodity, and it made his blood boil. For the first time in years, Frank felt the pull of something larger than his own broken life and obligation. That night, after his shift, he didn't go home. He went back to the orphanage. The building loomed tired and worn under the orange streetlights. Mrs. Harris met him at the door, her arms folded, her suspicion sharp as knives. "You again," she said flatly. "Whatever nonsense you filled Lily's head with last night, forget it. She's a child under my care. Not yours." Frank held her stare. "She's not nonsense. She's extraordinary. She's trouble." Harris snapped, sneaks out, disobeys, keeps other children awake. "I don't need strangers feeding her delusions." Before Frank could answer, Dr. Sarah Williams appeared in the hallway, her expression taut. "Mrs. Harris, you and I both know Lily isn't like the others. Denying her gift is cruel. What she needs is guidance. What she needs," Harris said, her voice rising, "is rules. Not every child with a toy violin is destined for greatness." Frank stepped past them, ignoring Harris's protests, and found Lily in the common room. She sat alone by the window, violin in her lap, bow resting idle across the strings. The light of a street lamp painted her face in pale gold. She looked up, and when she saw Frank, something softened in her eyes, recognition, maybe relief. "You came back," she said quietly. Frank cleared his throat. "Yeah, couldn't get your noise out of my head." She grinned, small but genuine. Then her expression faltered. "They want me to stop," she whispered, glancing at the door. "They said music won't feed me." "They're wrong," Frank said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Your music's the kind that feeds people in ways food can't. That's worth protecting." Before Lily could answer, the orphanage door slammed open. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The man in the scarf walked in as if he owned the place, flanked by a thin woman in a tailored coat carrying a leather briefcase. Harris hurried to greet him, her tone instantly deferential. "Mr. Conway," she said. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." Frank froze. Conway. The name clicked like a trap. This was no random admirer. Conway was a promoter he'd heard the name before from late-night passengers. Whispered as stories of broken prodigies chewed up and tossed aside. Astor's Conway's gaze landed on Lily, and his smile widened. "There she is, our little miracle." He gestured to the woman beside him. "This is Miss Sheldon, a representative who specializes in young talent. We've come to discuss Lily's future." Lily shrank back against the window, her violin clutched tightly to her chest. "Her future?" Frank barked. "She's 7 years old. Her future's supposed to be school, friends, safety, not your contracts." Conway's eyes flicked to him with annoyance. "And you are her protector," Frank growled. Conway laughed softly, the sound more threat than humor. "Protector? You're a bus driver, aren't you?" I checked. "Do you think you could shield her from the world, from what she was born to be?" Frank's fists curled. "She wasn't born to be your paycheck." The room tensed. Harris looked caught between fear and greed. Sarah Williams stepped forward, her voice firm. "Mr. Conway, Lily's gift is undeniable, but pushing her into professional contracts now would crush her. She's still a child." Conway's smile vanished. "Children don't play like that. Prodigies have a window, and hers is open now. Wait too long, and the world forgets." Lily's small voice cut through the adults arguing. "I don't want the world," she said, trembling. "I just want to play." The silence that followed was heavy. Frank looked at her, then at Conway, and made a decision. He stepped in front of Lily, his body shielding her. "You're not taking her," he said. Conway's lips curled into a smirk. "You think you have a choice? I'll have lawyers, judges, and half the city's press on my side before the week is out. That girl is mine to shape." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." The showdown was no longer about music. It was about power. An orphan girl with a violin caught between men who saw her as salvation, as prophet, or as something worth finally standing up for. And for the first time in years, Frank Dalton felt the fire of a fight he couldn't walk away from. Snow began to lash against the windows, wind howling like an omen. The stage was set for a battle that would test not just Lily's resilience, but Frank's courage to become more than the man he'd been. After snow fell in sheets the night, Lily Morgan was asked to prove herself. The city was alive with light, and sound Boston Symphony Hall glittered like a jewel in the storm, its grand arches glowing warm against the darkness. Inside, every velvet seat was filled, the air charged with anticipation. The benefit concert for children's hospitals had drawn Boston's elite, reporters, and critics. But this night carried a secret weight that most of them didn't know. For Lily, 7 years old and bound to a wheelchair, it wasn't just a concert. It was the battlefield where her future would be decided. Frank Dalton sat near the wings, his bus driver's jacket stiff across his shoulders, feeling out of place among tuxedos and gowns. His heart pounded as though he was about to step on stage himself. He had spent weeks fighting for Lily against the orphanage's doubts, against Conway's threats, against his own disbelief that he could be anything more than a weary man with regrets. Now it all came down to this, whether a little girl's music can silence greed. Behind the curtain, Lily sat with her violin in her lap, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She had chosen not to play the piece Conway demanded, the flashy showpiece that would dazzle donors, but strip her soul. Instead, she had written her own composition, something raw, something only she could play. Frank knelt beside her, lowering his rough hands onto the arms of her chair. "You ready?" he asked. Her eyes lifted, blue and unflinching. "I'm scared," she whispered. "But the music isn't." Frank swallowed hard. "Then let the music speak. Don't play for them. Don't play for Conway. Play for you." The stage manager signaled, and Lily rolled forward. The spotlight struck her small frame, fragile and powerful all at once. Gasps rippled through the hall, some startled at her youth, some at her wheelchair, most at the sheer audacity of a child taking center stage. She lifted the violin to her chin, closed her eyes, and began. The first notes were fractured, discordant shards of memory and sound. They told of car crashes and hospital corridors, of nights in the orphanage where hunger gnawed louder than lullabies. The audience shifted uncomfortably, unused to a child exposing such wounds. Then, slowly, the melody began to change. Softer tones emerged, fragile but determined, like a candle flame fighting the wind. It grew into something bolder, fuller, a hymn of survival. Reporters lowered their pens. Donors forgot their cocktails. Even Maestro Abramovich, seated among the dignitaries, leaned forward, his legendary sternness cracking into wonder. Frank gripped the curtain edge, every note drilling into him. He thought of his son Tyler, of the music he had let die in his own house. He thought of the years he had wasted letting bitterness drive him. And he thought of Lily, how she had cracked through the armor around his heart and forced him to feel again. Halfway through, Lily opened her eyes and found Frank in the wings. She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. Her gaze said everything. "This is for us. This is for what we fought for." Then came the final movement. The melody soared, higher, stronger, pulling the audience into its current. The storm outside battered against the hall's walls, but inside, Lily's music drowned it out, filling every corner with fire and hope. And as the last note hung trembling in the air, there was a silence so deep it felt holy. Then applause exploded like thunder. The hall shook with it. People stood, clapping until their hands hurt. Some wept openly. Lily bowed her head, her tiny shoulders trembling, not from fear this time, but from release. But not everyone clapped. From the front row, Conway rose slowly, his face pale with rage, Miss Sheldon whispering furiously at his side. This wasn't the agreement. He hissed under his breath. "She's mine. That girl is mine." Before he could move, Frank stepped forward, blocking his path. His voice carried louder than he intended, cutting across the crowd. "She doesn't belong to you. She never did." Heads turned. Cameras flashed. Conway sneered. "And who are you, Dalton? a bus driver. Do you think anyone will side with you over me? I'll have custody papers by dawn. Before Frank could reply, the hall side doors opened. Judge Marion Winters, the same judge presiding over the custody dispute, entered with 2 court officers summoned by Sarah Williams. She had come to see with her own eyes what words in a courtroom couldn't capture. The judge's voice rang out, commanding silence. I've heard enough arguments in chambers. Tonight, I've heard the truth, not in words, but in music. She turned her gaze on Conway, cold as steel. What I saw in this hall was not exploitation. It was authenticity. And what I saw in you, Mr. Conway, was greed, the audience murmured. Flashes popping like fireworks as reporters realized they were witnessing more than a concert. Judge Winters looked at Frank. Mr. Dalton, you may not be wealthy, you may not be polished, but I saw a child look to you tonight the way a daughter looks to a father. That matters more than contracts. She raised her voice, clear and final, effective immediately. Custody of Lily Morgan is awarded to Frank Dalton. The hall erupted again, not applause this time, but cheers. Lily gasped, her bow clattering onto her lap. Her eyes found Frank's, wide with shock and wonder. He moved to her side, kneeling so she wouldn't feel small in her chair. What does that mean? She whispered. Frank's throat tightened. He reached out, rough hand trembling as it rested over hers. It means you're coming home with me. For good. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but her smile broke through, radiant and unstoppable. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. I always wanted a dad, she whispered. And in that instant, Frank Dalton, a man who had driven buses through storms of loneliness for half his life, realized he had finally reached his destination, not at a depot, not at a stop, but here, with a little girl who had turned pain into music and given him a second chance at family. Outside, the snowstorm raged. Inside, a new song had begun.